Story 1. It was not so much what I saw as what I experienced. I was once underway in the Gulf of Alaska during a November gale. Waves reached up to 35 feet, with some rollers hitting 45 feet. An uncommon occurrence on the diesel-electric ship I was on was a cycloconverter tripping. When this happened, the ship would temporarily lose power and propulsion completely until electricians could reset everything. This occurred during that gale. I cannot explain how strange it is for the boat you are on to suddenly go so quiet that you can clearly hear waves slapping the hull and metal bending and flexing. Knowing you are completely at the mercy of the sea, and that if the ship lost its bearing and went beam on to the waves there was a real possibility of capsizing, is humbling. It is easy to forget when you are at sea that the only thing keeping you alive is a structure of steel welded together. In that moment I was fully aware, and it humbled me. Thankfully, we trained frequently for this and had everything powered up relatively quickly. Another time I recall was when the ship took a rogue wave. They are absolutely real, and I believe they account for a massive number of shipwrecks. It was late at night and I was on the bridge. We were passing through a storm and were taking waves on the bow with no visibility. As the ship moves, there is normally a standard pattern. You ride up a wave for a bit and then fall down the other side. We started riding up a wave and reached the point where we should have started our descent, but we just kept climbing and climbing. Then it happened. We began our ride down the back of this massive wave. All of us braced and tried to find something to hold on to, but we all fell to the deck anyway. Anything that was not secured for sea fell down all around us: manuals, tables, computers, printers, you name it. Our captain, who had been sleeping, called up to the bridge asking if we had hit something. It woke the entire crew. Rogue waves are real and they are terrifying. I cannot imagine being in a smaller boat or taking one of them broadside. Story 2. I was in the United States Navy for about 10 years and sailed tens of thousands of miles aboard an aircraft carrier. I spent countless nights on the flight deck in the middle of the ocean. Creepiest. A huge patch of the ocean glowing, like nuclear waste in The Simpsons. I have seen several kinds of bioluminescent algae and this was nothing like them. I have never seen anything like it before or since. Weirdest. Hundreds of miles out to sea there was a massive fire on the water. It looked like the top of a gas refinery on the surface of the ocean, with flames reaching a few stories high. Saddest. A fellow sailor tried to jump overboard. He had apparently received a Dear John email with photos of his wife cheating and decided to end his life. We were on the smoke deck. He borrowed a cigarette, asked the time, and when we said 2,300 he replied, "Sounds like a good time to die," and in one motion tried to launch over the chest-high railing that opened to the water. We were faster. We grabbed his legs, wrestled him down, laid on him, and basically hogtied him until the master at arms arrived. It broke my heart because he was a good person. I never saw him again. He was transferred off the ship shortly after. I'm not sure what happened to him, but I hope he is doing better. Funniest. 2 flying fish collided mid-air. I was smoking in the Persian Gulf and saw the fish fly from a distance toward each other. I thought there was no way they would hit and then splat, splash. I was in tears laughing, but no one saw it. Everyone just thought I was a weirdo, but I got to see that miracle of nature. Story 3. The furthest I have been out to sea was bay fishing, so I am not speaking from personal deepwater experience. One story that terrifies me is about a Chinese submarine that was caught in an ocean eddy. Ocean eddies are like enormous whirlpools. They can be at or below the water surface, and some are large enough to be seen from orbit. The submarine was caught in an eddy and began to drift downward toward crush depth. Even worse, the eddy was pulling them toward an oceanic trench. Inside a submarine you cannot see outside, so it must have felt like something in the trench had grabbed them and was dragging them down. They jettisoned ballast and eventually broke free before the submarine was crushed. The idea of a submarine suddenly stopping, moving in reverse against the crew's will, and heading toward a trench is terrifying. The ocean really fuels my imagination. Story 4. About 20 years ago, aboard the motor vessel Explorer near the Antarctic Circle, we were sailing among icebergs and occasionally making landfall. We entered a small bay and, among the ice and coastline, saw an unmarked sailing yacht, which was odd because yachts usually have identifying markings. The yacht did not respond to radio contact. Although I was not privy to the conversation and it was a long time ago, some crew went across in a Zodiac inflatable boat and were refused boarding. In short, a relatively small, unmarked yacht was in inhospitable Antarctic waters and refused assistance or contact. That was very strange. Story 5. Not creepy but totally weird. Two Chinese boats, small old fishing vessels, met in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean about half a mile behind us. This was so random, in international waters and extremely far from China. I still wonder what they were doing there. They had no automatic identification system. The first boat to arrive passed next to us as if to check who we were and whether we were keeping course. We were on a sailing vessel. It then headed straight for the other ship and joined it. Possibly drug trafficking or just fishing. It was still very far from their likely home port and felt odd. It was literally in the middle of the ocean, around 10 degrees north of the equator, so not a typical fishing route. Story 6. I used to be an oilfield diver in the Gulf of Mexico. I would say about 80% of the dives I logged were at night, mostly 500 feet and under on diving support vessels. It was a very eerie feeling sitting on the downline doing in-water decompression in the middle of the night. I would always ask the topside crew to turn off my headlight. I felt like a worm on a hook, just bobbing in the darkness. Story 7. Somewhere in the Atlantic, on a very cold night, I decided to step out and look at the stars. About 10 minutes later, a boat's mast popped up, stayed for a few minutes, then went back under. No alarms, nothing. Just some submersible crew members getting a bit of late-night oxygen in the middle of nowhere near some friends. Story 8. I am a recreational sailor who travels for weeks at a time at sea. I once saw a flame on the water not 10 yards from my boat, burning at midnight. Story 9. This somewhat qualifies. I am a former Navy sailor. Somewhere off the coast of Italy I saw a very small boat, not much bigger than a rowboat, about 10 miles offshore. This was around midnight. There was no light from land and no other ships around. It had a light. The ship's captain said it was a fishing boat and that fish would be attracted to the light at night. Imagine being in a rowboat about 10 miles offshore on a pitch-black night, waiting to see what finds you. Story 10. In 20 years, the strangest thing I have seen is the other people who work out here. About 40% of the sailors like what they do and are good at it. Another 40% are good at it but would choose something better if the money were right. The remaining 20%, if they lived ashore for more than 6 months a year, would end up dead or incarcerated. There is no more west for them to go to, so they went offshore and became our problem. Story 11. A dead body was recovered in the tropics and was not in good condition. We turned it over to the authorities at the nearest port. There were enough teeth remaining to identify the person by dental records. I hope the family found closure. A commenter was correct. The body was double-bagged and stored in the walk-in freezer until our next port visit. There was a significant amount of cleaning and decontamination involved, but that is the gist of it. Story 12. Not so much creepy as eerie to be out on the open sea at night in a lightning storm with a slack wind. The ocean was very flat, with no big rolling swells, just tiny ripples. The world was black. Then a flurry of lightning turned it silver. The ocean looked like aluminum foil that had been scrunched up and flattened. The water looked like mercury, and the ripples cast dramatic black shadows. Story 13. What I am learning from these comments is that the ocean makes people poets. Story 14. Creepiest thing I have seen is watching myself and other crewmates lose our minds. On one particularly awful voyage, everything that could go wrong did go wrong. We went without food, water, or sleep for an unhealthy amount of time. It began with auditory hallucinations. Ships are noisy, and when you are going crazy you begin to think those noises are talking to you. I heard children laughing, a choir singing, and most disturbing, a splash that sounded like it was calling my name from the sea. Visual hallucinations followed and things became terrifying. I was convinced we were in a desert at one point, with sand all around and mountains in the distance. Another crew member panicked and insisted we were about to run into an apartment building. The strangest thing I saw was an all-black flying pig with red eyes on the bow. The scariest moment came when someone became convinced we had lost part of our crew overboard, which turned into a massive, delirious argument about where everyone was, even though we were all accounted for. That trip was brutal. The captain had put us in a terrible situation through sheer incompetence. Another time I saw 3 gigantic ships in the distance with no lights, and they did not appear on the automatic identification system. Suddenly they were gone. It was extremely creepy. Story 15. I was drinking in an airport bar and met a woman who worked as a commercial fisher. She was on her way to Southeast Asia for rest and relaxation with her family. She was salt of the earth. She regaled me with stories about her work and the reasons she had kept doing it for decades. I asked her what the scariest thing she had seen on the open ocean was, and without hesitation she said, "Oh, an underwater unidentified flying object. I saw one rise out of the ocean next to my boat and fly into the sky." The matter-of-fact nature of her answer bothers me to this day. Story 16. Years ago my friends and I visited Thailand and went on several excursions on a boat with a captain. One evening we were out at night. It was pitch black except for green lights from large commercial fishing boats in the distance. We stopped to take in the view and eat when it started to rain. The captain thought it best to head back, but he quickly realized that the boat propeller was not working and something was caught on it. He grabbed his head-mounted flashlight and a knife and jumped in the water. He was gone for a minute, which felt like an eternity as we huddled around trying to figure out what was happening. Fear began to set in as we waited. He re-emerged panting and said that shortly after he jumped in he lost his flashlight. He had to feel his way underwater to the propeller, cut a plastic tarp that had wrapped itself around it, free the propeller and surface in the dark. We were impressed by his daring and relieved he had returned, but also shaken imagining what would have happened if he had not. Story 17. I was in a glass-bottom boat in the 1970s off the coast of Oahu. We were going out to see a pod of whales. The boat captain was a grizzled Hawaiian, sun-baked to the color of mahogany. It was an older boat, retrofitted with a glass bottom and bench seating. He narrated over the public address system as we left the dock. We motored out for about 30 minutes, and the view through the glass bottom was disappointing, with long streams of bubbles obscuring the view. Finally, he stopped the boat and the view was amazing. The captain pointed out a pod of whales about a quarter of a mile away. They cavorted, diving and breaching. The captain explained their behavior while keeping his distance. It was pretty cool. All the whales suddenly dived and disappeared, emerging moments later right next to our boat. They swam all around us, diving, breaching, and splashing water. Children laughed. Everyone thought it was part of the show. They were almost close enough to touch. The captain told us how lucky we were to see them up close. Suddenly the mood changed when they started bumping the hull of the small boat. People slid everywhere. Some fell to the floor and children cried. Most telling, the captain stopped narrating and wore a look of abject terror. I remember thinking what it must take to make this man scared, and that if he looked terrified we probably should be too. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, the whales disappeared. People picked themselves up and sat down. Mothers consoled children, and we headed back to the dock. The captain used the public address system to downplay the seriousness of what had just happened, but there was a definite quiver in his voice as we headed back to shore. Story 18. Not exactly in the water, but body parts are in a sea chest. A sea chest is a hole in the hull used for water intake. Story 19. Right. Long-time lurker, first-time poster here. I'm no longer at sea, but when I was younger and more romantic I spent months at a time on cargo ships. Mostly tankers, crude oil, very large crude carriers, and refined product tankers with some time in oil and gas and towing. I came ashore in 2017 with a Master Unlimited certificate, sailing as chief officer. My last ship was a self-discharging bulk carrier. Anyway, I digress. It wasn't so much what I saw that was creepy. I saw plenty of interesting things I wouldn't have seen anywhere else. I was second mate on a tanker distributing refined oil products around the coast of New Zealand. A yacht had sailed from a port on the east coast, bound for another port a bit down the coast, but it had disappeared. A solo sailor was on board, aside from his dog. The search proved fruitless and was suspended. 4 weeks afterwards, at about 1:30 a.m., the Rescue Coordination Centre New Zealand would broadcast a plea at the end of the weather and navigation warning, asking the yacht to make contact if it could hear the message and was able to do so. I'd sit in the dark, chain-smoking and on my 7th cup of coffee, looking into the black and imagining the man who had had a stroke or heart attack on board, with the same broadcast playing on his radio while his dog ate him to keep from starving. Or imagining him having fallen overboard, watching his yacht sail indifferently off into the distance with his dog in the cockpit, pacing and agitated and unable to do anything, knowing you were doomed and had only a matter of hours left before the cold or exhaustion took you. Or imagining the dog starving and dying on the yacht weeks later, listening to the same broadcast in the dark. The places your mind goes when you are alone in the dark. They found the yacht in the end. The dog was still alive. Story 20. One night during the midnight to 4:00 watch in the Persian Gulf aboard a military transport ship, the sky went from pitch black at 2 a.m. to fully lit in a second. It lasted about 30 seconds, then returned to pitch black. We called the neighboring ships and headquarters. No one knew what had happened. Our best guess was a meteor. A couple of years earlier, while cruising near the Philippines, we saw nothing visually or on radar. Then suddenly a faint white light appeared about 100 yards off our port bow. We typically do not allow anything within a mile of our ship. We grabbed binoculars and went to the bridge wing. It was just a small banka boat with an outboard motor and a flashlight. Even with radar, night vision goggles, and an infrared camera, we could not see this man's little 20-foot boat in 6-foot seas without its lights on. I have experienced more bizarre incidents than genuinely frightening ones in my career so far. The people are the craziest thing you will encounter at sea. I once served with a sailor who would not go outside the skin of the ship at night because he believed aliens would abduct him. Story 21. I worked as a tuna fisherman briefly. I would spend 3 to 4 weeks at sea at a time, and it took about 3 days of continuous travel to reach the fishing grounds with the captain, a 5th-generation fisherman. There are many stories, but one stands out. Near the end of the season, we pushed farther out than we should have, over 100 nautical miles, where a 37-foot trawler had no business being. Then we were caught in a bad storm. I barely had time to board up all the windows before the boat started scooping on the downstroke of a 12-foot wave. The first third of the bow would dive underwater before popping back up, then climb another wave and repeat as the seas grew larger. The captain and I stayed in the cabin, bracing with each wave and watching the radar, hoping to take the seas head-on and avoid capsizing. After a few minutes, seeing the fear in the captain, I accepted that I might die. That acceptance, and the event itself, profoundly affected my outlook and how I have lived since. We eventually made it out and did not say much to each other afterward. There are many stories from that time, but this was the creepiest. Story 22. I have a friend who works on ships. The single scariest thing he ever saw was looking out a window and seeing a wave that looked to be 100 meters high pass right by his ship and suddenly disappear. He knew about rogue waves, but seeing one that large and that close and watching it vanish left him stunned for a minute. Story 23. I worked on a sailboat one summer in the Bahamas. One thing you see a lot when you are in the ocean is kayaks and life jackets floating around. You always report them by radio, but they usually fell off a yacht or something and it was never a big deal. Once we found a kayak floating with a fishing rod in the rod holder, which basically meant someone had been using it. I did not see how viral this went overnight. Some people asked questions. The Coast Guard does not usually look into this kind of report unless there is additional information, so we never received an update. I would not have expected one unless there was a full-scale search. We went up close to the kayak and it still had the removable seat cushion, which further convinced us someone had been using it. There was nothing else to see. The line was in the water, but we did not revisit it. We tried not to talk about it because the children on the boat became creeped out after the adults reacted emotionally and did not control themselves. Story 24. I was on a 32-foot speedboat and got caught at night between islands. There were no navigation lights on the boat. We were navigating using the global positioning system and a depth finder. The captain knew the waters like the back of his hand. He had sailed there since he was a child. But for me it was my first time in the middle of the ocean at night. It was pitch black except for the stars. As above, so below. It felt as if the boat floated in the blackest void of the universe. Years later, I saw the movie Life of Pi and the scene where Pi is in his lifeboat floating in the dark among the stars, no above, no below. It was exactly like that. I still dream about that night. The engulfing dark and a silence that was not silent. It was surreal. We made it safely to port. The captain installed navigation lights the next day. Story 25. I was underway from the port of Houston to Cartagena, Colombia. The vessel had all exterior lights off, so it was very dark. I would sit on the deck, listen to music on my headphones, and look at the stars. One night, somewhere in the middle of the Caribbean Sea, I saw a swarm of lightning bugs cross the boat. It blew my mind to see light out of nowhere. At least I think they were lightning bugs. On the same trip, returning to Houston from Colombia, I witnessed what I think was a satellite crashing. It strobed steadily and lit up the night sky and the water for about 15 minutes until I could no longer see it. On a different trip, in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico with no moon, no clouds, and no light pollution, the number of stars I saw made me cry. I never thought starlight alone could cast a shadow. It was definitely mesmerizing, and I still remember it as if it were yesterday. Story 26. I sailed on the American aircraft carrier the United States ship George Washington in 2000 and 2002. I remember several things. We could not moor alongside the pier in Lisbon, Portugal, so we had to take boats back and forth. I looked down and there was not a square inch of water without a jellyfish. We were sailing through a giant bloom, and I wondered whether someone could survive falling in. The United States ship Cole was part of our battle group. We left her behind in the Red Sea while we transited the Suez Canal. Once we entered the Mediterranean Sea, the admiral used the ship-wide announcing system to report that a rigid-hulled inflatable boat had struck her and blown a hole in the side. About a month later, as we were pulling into Palma, Spain, a rigid-hulled inflatable boat came barreling toward us. The security detail was called to deck and prepared to fire, but the commanding officer ordered them not to shoot. It turned out to be Greenpeace. For the next 5 hours, Greenpeace and hundreds of supporters circled the ship in boats and jet skis. They probably had no idea how close they came to being killed that day. Sailing across the Atlantic, especially in winter, could get intense. Carriers had advanced stabilization systems because the flight deck needed to be safe for landings. Even so, there were times when the ship bobbed around like a cork. The band Three Doors Down held a concert aboard the ship during that visit and made a video. Story 27. A few things come to mind, but I have to say deadheads. In my younger days, I was captain of a dragger out of Kodiak, Alaska. She was a 130-foot Giddings marine trawler. I will never forget my first week in the wheelhouse with the owner, who was retiring and showing me the operation before I took over. After a night busting ice off the rails in freezing rain and 2-meter seas, he went to bunk and left me to keep watch. It was clearing up with a moderate haze and flat calm waters. Most of the crew was sleeping or hanging out in the galley, so I was alone and the only eyes forward. I was drinking some nasty Folgers and sucking down a Marlboro Red when I saw what looked like an old pier piling straight ahead. I kept looking at that spot, and nothing was there. A few seconds later, I thought I saw it again, but closer. Gone again. I thought I had been up way too long and was hallucinating. Then, out of nowhere, this tree trunk shot directly up into the sky. It had to be 60 feet tall and was about 30 feet off the bow, dead center. I nearly shit myself. I pushed to port and rubbed the tree with the right side of the bow. We were doing a good 14-knot clip, which is fast as hell for an almost fully loaded trawler. Then it shot down and disappeared about midship. I later learned that these are pretty uncommon in the Aleutians, where we were fishing. They're called deadheads, and only 2 of the guys on the boat had seen them before. They float vertically and bob straight up and down. These things were known to destroy older wooden boats and kill crews. I'm just glad I wasn't dragging the net. It would have cost us in the ballpark of 100,000. I've seen what most people would consider worse, But the fear that a huge bobbing tree in the middle of Alaskan waters could come out of nowhere tops my list. Story 28. I was once deployed to a Taiwanese high-seas driftnet vessel as a fisheries observer. The vessel I was placed on would deploy its net and the crew would then seek a few hours' sleep. They usually got no more than 5 hours when actively fishing. Often the captain would stay up and hand jig for squid, which he dried and packed away. One night I got up to urinate and no one was awake. We were 1,500 miles from the nearest land, approximately equidistant between Midway Atoll and the Aleutian Islands. The waters were calm and the moon lit the sea under a partly cloudy sky. I went out to the rail and began urinating overboard. The ship began to rock. Moments later I realized that a monstrous container ship was passing our stern at a distance of less than 100 yards. The ship was so large it filled my entire field of view. To this day I wonder whether anyone aboard that vessel had been paying attention. We were not. Story 29. It was 1998. I was only 11 and out for a quick boat ride with some family. Swissair Flight 111 had recently crashed a bay or two away. We saw a suitcase floating in the water, and my dad quickly turned the boat back to shore. Story 30. Sometimes at night I went out of my accommodation on board merchant ships to breathe fresh air or take out the trash because the garbage station was outside. When it was completely dark and the water was calm, you could hear the water splashing against the hull. I cannot explain why, but the ocean seemed to lure me while at the same time I felt terrified, because no one would find me if I fell overboard. I would stand and stare into the dark water, torn between a part of me that wanted to jump and the part that knew it would be a one-way trip. I still cannot explain this hypnotic feeling and the chills that ran down my spine at the thought of falling into the water. It would be game over. Story 31. A man was swimming alone in the Java Sea. He had been floating for a couple of days. Although several boats had passed him, he did not dare hail a ship not from Indonesia because he feared being taken as a slave. It is possible he was a little mad, but he seemed happy that we had arrived. Story 32. Probably a giant squid, well in excess of 10 meters by a conservative estimate. It was clinging to the bow and hull of our emergency escape vessel, hanging a few meters out of the water and a few meters below where I was standing. Late at night, I stepped out for a smoke and happened to look down at the rescue boat. The shadow did not look right in the moonlight. Stupidly, I used my phone flashlight, a big no-no on a darkened ship, and it scared the life out of me. The vessel it was wrapped around was about 15 meters long, and its tentacles were draped over the gunnels 2/3 of the way down the sides. Within seconds it detached and fell back into the ocean. I can still picture its eyeball, the size of a football, staring at me before it dropped into the water. It still gives me chills. Story 33. I am not a sailor at all, but I did a few boat trips with a friend who moved boats for a living. He usually carried boats from the French Riviera, including Monaco, Nice, Antibes, and Cannes, to Corsica. On my first trip with him, we left Monaco on our way to Calvi, I think. We left in the evening and the trip started very well, with dolphins following us around. A nice moment. Around 2 a.m. In the middle of a pitch-black night and very far from any coast, we saw a tiny light in the distance, almost on our course. As we got closer, we saw it was a small fishing boat, the kind that usually does not go far from shore, except we were more than 100 kilometers from land. We slowed and called out to check if anyone was on board, but there was no answer. We went closer and it soon became obvious the boat was empty. There were a few bottles of water, some snacks, fishing gear, even dead fish in a bucket, and an old Nokia phone still on, but nobody. My friend called on the radio and explained the situation. The Italian Coast Guard told us to wait until they arrived. They took our identification, wrote down our account, and let us go to finish our trip. The whole thing was creepy. It seemed obvious the owner had fallen from his boat, could not get back in, and drowned. I had this in mind for weeks, thinking we might have rescued him if we had passed slightly earlier. After a while, the story faded from my mind and I went on with my life. Then one day my friend called to say an Italian man had thanked him because he had recovered his boat thanks to us. He was the owner of the small boat. He explained he had been out fishing not far from shore when he had a severe chest pain. He made an emergency call and was soon rescued, but his boat had been left to drift until we found it. Learning that the man was still alive erased the creepy feeling, and I was relieved. Story 34. A toilet. A literal household toilet floating hundreds of miles from land. Why was it floating? I will never know. Story 35. I am a former Navy sailor. The Indian Ocean is absolutely infested with sharks. You see nothing but dorsal fins extending all the way to the horizon. Story 36. I worked in hospitality, including on a private yacht in the Baltic. We were far from shore late at night. I assumed everyone else had gone to sleep, but I was not very sleepy after a stressful day. A senior crew member helming the ship on the night shift was at an angle and could not see me. I went on deck and looked at the ocean. Do you know that strange feeling when you sense someone is looking at you? I could swear there was something below the surface moving in time with us. I do not remember how much time passed. It felt like a very long time. I stared at the edge of my vision, thinking I would see something. Could have been fish or a marine mammal, but it felt wrong. I wish I had a more interesting conclusion than that. I do not even remember returning to the cabin I shared with two other stewards. The next morning I did not mention it, but a few days later I brought it up. No one thought much of it except one deckhand who had spent many years at sea. He said he had felt and seen the same thing several times, but only at night and only when he was alone. I have no idea what to make of it, but I feel in my heart that it was not an animal. Story 37. I was in the United States Navy in the late 1980s and early 1990s. We cruised through the Indian Ocean in total darkness. I woke the next afternoon, looked over the rails, and saw hundreds of sharks swimming alongside us. Every now and then we received a man overboard alert. They never recovered a single person at night. These were usually suicides. Story 38. Two things. First was the number of stars you can see from the middle of the Atlantic. I had a girlfriend with me, and we would talk while watching shooting stars. I swear some of them were just moving, not shooting, but who really knows? It gave me the sense that humans are just egotistical ants in the universe. Second was when the ocean was smooth as glass. When I stepped onto the ship's deck, I silently gasped because I was truly terrified. The calmness and the lack of a distinct horizon were terrifying. I went back inside the ship out of fear, then returned about 10 minutes later and simply breathed. The most terrifyingly amazing part of the calmness was seeing the clouds reflected in the ocean and the occasional ripple. I felt as if I had crossed into another dimension, into a heaven I was not supposed to see. Story 39. Submarine sailor. Nothing creepy, but some of my best memories are sitting on top of the sail, smoking a cigarette in the pitch black under the stars. We had an electrical fire in the engine room one time. Another time, during an emergency reactor shutdown exercise, we accidentally flooded the diesel engines. That was scary. I just remembered one of the worst memories. We were on patrol underwater for weeks without fresh air. We had completed our mission and were heading into port. I went up the sail to have a smoke almost immediately after we had it rigged. Climbing back down afterward, the smell that filled my nostrils was overwhelming. 175 men who had curtailed personal hygiene for many weeks. Ammonia and body odor. It was downright putrid. Since we were surfaced, we ventilated, and only the three of us got to experience it. Story 40. Floes of ice passed by, covered in blood. Then I remember that polar bears exist. Honestly, calm water and flat light. You can't see where the sea and the sky split. It is really dangerous for helicopters and generally unsettling. Story 41. Nothing too out of the ordinary, but two things stand out. Occasionally, I must enter the water in the middle of the ocean for man overboard drills. Looking down and seeing nothing is a little eerie. Seeing storm systems develop in the distance is both cool and surreal. I see massive storm clouds forming a waterspout, although they seldom fully develop, and lightning lights up the horizon. At night, it is especially powerful. All you see is white light. Otherwise, there is only occasional marine life. My job is mundane, but it has its moments. Story 42. This is not a job. but I have gone scuba diving in the dark. There was a moment when I strayed a little too far from the lights and lost track of where the surface was. Around me was a dimly lit void, nothing but tiny bubbles and particles drifting through the beam of my small torch. It almost felt as if I were asleep, as if nothing existed except me and the void. There was a definite dreamlike quality to the experience, probably because I was floating. It was beautiful, and I imagine it was a little like being in space, but there was also the terror of being somewhere I did not belong. Being in a medium my body was not made for is a very sharp feeling. The realization that if I kept swimming in the wrong direction my life could be in danger probably would not have occurred to me if I had not been trained for this scenario. It is easy to panic in that situation. I eventually managed to orient myself by following the bubbles from my mask, and it turned out I was not that far from the surface. When I got back up, I realized I was a lot farther from the boat than I had thought. I swam the whole way back less than a meter below the surface. The time from realizing I was lost to reaching open air was probably less than a minute, but it felt like an eternity. Anyone who has been in the ocean at night would agree. It is a different world out there. Story 43. My husband used to go crayfishing on the Bass Strait, the stretch of water between Tasmania and mainland Australia. The most interesting thing he saw was about 15 meters from the boat. A shark leapt out of the water with a seal in its mouth and ripped it to shreds. He said it was like watching the Discovery Channel. Story 44. It was not seen but heard. I was a sound navigation and ranging technician on a Los Angeles-class submarine for 4 years. There are sounds out there that not even the most seasoned acoustic intelligence specialists could identify. I like to imagine they were the ancient ones rolling over in their sleep, or some alien technology powering up. Story 45. I worked on a commercial fishing boat in Alaska one summer. One early morning before sunrise, I woke because I heard what sounded like a woman moaning not far from the boat. We were a few miles off the coast near Bristol Bay. It was really creepy. The captain said it was seals. Shortly after, a massive storm blew in. Story 46. I am a United States Navy sailor. I have seen many remarkable things, but the creepiest was a great white shark that swam, more like drifted, in between the two ships during an underway replenishment off the coast of Australia. I could guess its size, but let me just say it was far larger than the biggest sharks I have seen on Shark Week and much longer and twice as massive as the largest sharks shown in YouTube videos. It did not move a single inch. It just floated mouth open in between the ships as everyone on the bridge wing exclaimed, "Holy shit!" Its teeth were as big as a man's head, and it had massive scars down its back and tail from a ship's propeller. I would not have believed it if I had not seen it with my own eyes. Story 47. Oh hey, one I can actually answer. This isn't the creepiest story. I'll admit that straight away. I was working on a tiny oil rig off the Gulf Coast at about 2 p.m. I was on what was called sliver duty. Basically, you wait between two relatively close walls on the exterior of the rig, strapped into a safety harness, while someone feeds a long cable that you direct. Boring, but you get a nice view of the ocean for an hour or two. Suddenly, my buddy on the other end of the sliver started screaming for me to look down. I looked and saw the biggest sea creature I had ever seen. From end to end, it must have been the size of a rural hospital. Just below the surface, it raised its head out and I realized I was really dumb and was staring at an undersea cable layer. Story 48. Contract Mariner. I disappear into the blue area for 6 to 8 months a year. Creepy? Not much, honestly. The sound of moaning steel from slack tanks when you're rolling really hard can be a bit unnerving. Elmo's fire is pretty neat. Fata Morgana, also known as the Flying Dutchman, is cool to see in real life. After a while, the only thing out there that really spooks you is a problem that directly affects your survival. All the spooky things I've experienced have been real emergencies. Fire in the engine control room. I'm the first responder down there to see if it's an actual emergency or a faulty concilium sensor. A wall of toxic smoke from burning electronics and the high voltage room. Oh fuck. Have an emergency weather sortie because we are dragging anchor and rolling 30 degrees with 50 feet under keel clearance and we're getting pushed toward the island? Fuck me, 10 shots aren't enough. We are about to run aground in a 55,000-ton, 800-foot ship. Pucker factor. Oops, now we get the hookup to get the fuck out of there and we immediately lose steering and propulsion. Good shit. I've seen brand new $1 million sport fishers capsized and bobbing around like corks 1,000 miles from land. I've seen tiny songbirds skipping along the surface, barely clinging to life, flying as hard as they can to find land. Some of the saddest things I've ever seen are those little birds skipping off the water as they fly further out to sea, hoping to find land. I don't know. I'm on a Yangling at a port bar and I'm rambling. In short, the creepiest thing about being out there is the bottomless depth of sadness, loneliness, and heartache. You go places in your mind that words cannot do justice. Story 49. I don't think I'll ever get used to how dark it can get. On moonless nights, calm seas can be a bit hypnotic. Story 50. A drunk crew boat captain collided with an unmanned oil platform 20 miles offshore. It lit up the sky like the sun rising, even though it was 2 in the morning. Story 51. I saw a really large whale. It looked me straight in the face, as if it knew I was human even though I knew it was a whale. I remember I sort of let out a small wow. The whale just looked at me. Story 52. I saw someone pick up a half-eaten Snickers bar from a deck riser next to the toilet in the head of the combat system's berthing and continue eating it. That head flooded with waste from the collection, holding, and transfer system, also known as black water or sewage, at least once a week because the sounding and security watch fell asleep instead of responding to the tankful alarm and pressing the pump button. Story 53. He was a competitive endurance rower crossing the Atlantic. One night his small boat was in the Middle Passage, where many slave ships sailed centuries ago. The sea was extremely calm, with no wind. He said he could hear voices whispering in a language he did not understand. On another occasion, in rough seas, he looked up into the waves above his head and saw the silhouettes of sharks. I like being on land. Edit. They made a documentary about the race. Story 54. I have always found the dark of night eerie, with a jet-black sky and an even darker ocean washing by. It removed my frame of reference. As a former miner who learned the true darkness of underground work to be somewhat meditative when I occasionally turned off my headlamp, I never grew used to the void of the dark ocean at night. The eeriest thing was that, over 3 days, several blackbirds struck the side of the ship and fell into the crates below, dead. I would reach into a crate for equipment and pull out a rigid black body. They did not bleed. They simply died. I could not help but see it as a bad omen, but nothing happened, and birds are known to gravitate toward ships. One day during the same voyage I reached into a crate, felt something wriggle and pulled out a live, but shaken, black bird. We let it rest on the ship and gave it space until it was ready to take off. Even though I have seen worse during my career, the birds still stick with me, and I think about them often. Story 55. Reefs in the middle of nowhere. You can anchor and see everything, but they do not rise above sea level, so from the horizon nothing is visible. Story 56. I was a commercial fisherman. One morning a Russian submarine surfaced about a quarter-mile off our stern with its periscope fully raised. We had a state marine biologist on board as an observer. He said, "Is that a goddamn submarine?" We were drinking coffee when this happened, and the captain kind of pretended it was not there. He did not call it in on the radio. In fact, we assumed it was an American submarine because we were near a United States Navy base. The United States Coast Guard showed up and tried to hail the submarine by radio. The captain had left our radio on an emergency channel to listen in. I will never forget our faces when we heard, "Russian submarine Viktor Leonov, please respond." Story 57. Back when I was a cadet on a merchant ship, I was constantly exhausted and overworked and began experiencing hallucinations at night. My watch started at 4 a.m. One day we hit a storm. The wind was so strong it made a wailing sound like someone crying outside. I went to check and saw a shadowy figure sitting in the corner. I knew I was hallucinating, but I was terrified. I never went outside during a storm after that. Story 58. Fast, darting white lights appeared in the middle of the night. They moved very erratically, then stayed still like drones but were very far away and seemingly too fast. They moved in straight lines, never diagonally. We were at least 300 nautical miles from land in the Pacific Ocean. Story 59. There is some strangely beautiful writing in this thread. It is as if everyone is writing to the same beat. Even the simplest sentences sound amazing. Story 60. This question is reposted every year and is always a solid thread with new answers to enjoy while scrolling. Story 61. My father served in Vietnam on an aircraft carrier. He said they were on the nets hanging over the side getting some sun. A plane came in to land, and they stood with their heads above the deck to watch. As the plane approached, the arresting cable broke, and in a second it snapped his friend's head off. The head was about a foot from him, flew like a football into the water, and fell into the net. My father said they stopped the ship to try to find the head, but there was no chance. It was more a courtesy. Story 62. This happened to my cousin's ex-wife a few months ago in Ecuador. She is a researcher or scientist. I believe the company she worked for chartered a captain and a boat to go offshore. The boat started sinking. I don't know how. She managed to get a signal on her phone and called and texted my cousin about the situation before losing signal again. My cousin contacted the authorities and the Coast Guard, and a search began. 8 to 10 hours passed before they were found. When the Coast Guard reached them, my cousin's ex-wife had absorbed so much seawater that her face and body were swollen and badly sunburned. If it had not been for the life jackets and the plastic fuel containers they held onto because they floated, they would have sunk and drowned. Story 63. I used to sail a large portion of Alaskan waters in the Coast Guard, from Juneau out to the Bering Sea, mostly in the Gulf of Alaska. After a while, watching green water come over the bow was not so frightening. Rough weather became more of an inconvenience because you could not go out for a smoke without getting your cigarette wet. Some of the eeriest times were when the fog rolled in and the water lay still. It felt surreal, and other than the vessel as a visual reference, it was hard to determine orientation. Other times were when we were out at sea with nothing for miles and thick cloud cover, so not even the stars were visible. If you walked the weather deck at night with the conditions just right, you were instantly swallowed by the darkness as soon as you exited the hatch. Having served in the Coast Guard, I did a bit of everything. Submarine escorts, body recovery, search and rescue, fisheries patrol, and other Coast Guard duties. The only time I was ever genuinely scared was steaming toward Amiknak Island from the Bering Sea during a winter storm. The waves were so big that you could occasionally hear the propellers coming out of the water. We took one wave on the beam, and I watched and held on as our inclinometer approached 60 degrees. Our ship was rated for 65 degrees. I do not think I have ever been so frightened. I had nightmares about it for a couple of weeks. All in all, I miss being out on the sea. Perhaps someday I will find my way back. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.